Do you bring an acoustic guitar to literally every single social event or gathering you go to, which somehow makes you even more unlikable than the abhorrent stench? Are you completely opposed to the idea of electricity and only create music out of instruments made entirely from scraps of wood you stole from a local dump? Do you enjoy partaking in a little bit of... Well, it seems like folk punk is the perfect genre for you. Also, I'd just like to sincerely apologise just for everything. If you're wondering what folk punk actually is, if you think for a few seconds about the two words within the genre's name, you can probably figure it out pretty quickly. If you really need me to lay it out for you, it's the combination of folk and punk, which essentially translates to the speed and attitude of punk being played on an acoustic guitar and recorded with the equipment. That basically gives you all the information you need, but you best believe I'm going to harass your neurons with even more fast-paced, ignorant information. Folk punk is incredibly minimalist, with effects or even mastering rarely being used. They essentially just play really fast, punk-style riffs on their acoustic guitar and record it with whatever recording equipment they were able to trade for 2 cigarettes and an overly edgy patch. If you think punk is DIY, you haven't seen nothing yet. Punk needs a recording studio to be made, or at least electricity, maybe even an electric guitar. Folk punk needs none of this, which leads me to the conclusion that 95% of folk punk music has never been heard by the masses, as it's only played around incredibly stinky and overly hairy fire pits. Although the acoustic guitar is the instrument that shines through, other folk instrumentation can be used, such as banjos, ukuleles, double bass, or brass instruments. Percussion very rarely involves a traditional drum kit. It's probably far too big to fit in the car that most of the musicians live out of. Instead, percussion within the genre often involves DIY instruments like washboards. Although these instruments are present in some songs in the genre, more often than not you'll just hear an acoustic guitar and one of the most whiny individuals walking the face of the earth. That unfortunately brings me to the vocals. They follow the DIY aesthetic, and you may be thinking, aren't vocals DIY anyway, you're just doing it yourself? And I guess that's true, but I don't know, for some reason hearing this dude wail completely out of key about how many cigarettes he smoked before midday sounds more DIY than a classically trained singer. One of the more common singing styles I've come across is this kind of speak-sing. It basically sounds like the singer is narrating their own life, similar to a sitcom. The ethos and culture behind the scene allows for a wide range of voices that sound not only unique but incredibly unhealthy. Lyrics oftentimes follow a typical punk formula, you know, f the government, anarchy is a good idea, I wasn't hugged enough as a child, but can sometimes get more extreme than what is seen in punk. A lot of punk or modern hardcore lyrics are pretty egotistical. That is the complete opposite in folk punk. Everyone is insecure and it shows in the lyrics. A lot of the lyricism focuses on politics, which is pretty standard. What is strange is some of the overtly schizophrenic ramblings you can hear whilst listening to folk punk. Lyricism can delve into some pretty strange topics, with each topic being more depraved than the last. The one thing that ties it all together, an artist usually can't go 5 lines without mentioning cigarettes, or coffee, or God, or coffee, God and cigarettes. The early influences are made pretty obvious by the name of the genre. Obviously the precursors to folk punk will be within the folk and punk genres. Many bands that would go on to somewhat influence elements of punk would be inspired by folk artists such as Bob Dylan, Donovan and Fugs, which may lead you to believe that punk has always had elements of folk, but that isn't true, that would be silly. The two genres didn't really smash their big dome pieces together until 1977 with the release of Patrick Fitzgerald's song Safety Pin Stuck in My Heart. Apparently Patrick couldn't afford an electric guitar, but still had an urge to incomprehensibly ramble over a fast-paced guitar, so decided to use an acoustic guitar instead, inserting punk imagery and a crude style of singing, essentially creating folk punk there and then. Most genres decide to evolve over time, but honestly, Safety Pin Stuck in My Heart sounds exactly how a modern folk punk release would sound. Unfortunately, Patrick Fitzgerald and his new stinky punk baby didn't gain much traction outside of the local scene, but punk and folk were destined for each other, and it wouldn't be too long until artists were combining the two genres, this time to much greater commercial success. Originally inspired by bands like the Velvet Underground, the Violet Femmes would start their career busking. Their first big performance would come when the Pretenders lead singer, Chrissie Hynde, would see them busking outside one of their shows and invite them to play a set beforehand. The band would project pop-punk energy onto acoustic instrumentation, not only increasing the possibilities of the subgenre, but also the amount of crusty eardrums being subjected to folk punk. This American scene would be supplemented by some hardcore bands introducing acoustic songs and some folk aspects into some of their music. Examples include Husker Du, Dead Milkmen, and Articles of Faith. Psychedelic hardcore band The Meat Puppets would actually insert punk elements into their more so country folk album. They basically flipped the creation process, resulting in an album that fits into a similar category. As punk began to lose popularity due to it sounding it left space for folk punk to receive some popularity, as it is a genre that has a lot of the same quirks and appeals as punk, although is often kinder to the ears. Of course, Britain were building their own folk punk scene at the exact same time, although the British scene had much worse dental hygiene, which is probably seen as a positive to most folk punk fans. The Pogues would form in 1982, with many of their early songs actually being covers of folk songs performed in a way that is more akin to punk. This would be combined with original songs that would utilise extremely speedy folk instrumentation. The Pogues would become very successful and nowadays are most known for that one Christmas song, as well as those Butter's Teeth. The 80s would further develop the folk punk sound with bands such as Oyster Band, The Levelers, Chumbawamba and Attila the Stockbroker introducing some pretty wacky instruments into the mix. Essentially whatever instruments the local pawn shop had at the time was being used to create distinctively fast and unique folk music. 1994 would see the creation of Planet X Records, an independent label based around the DIY punk ethos. They actually subscribed to the ethos as opposed to just using it as a marketing strategy. They would sell every CD for $5 or less with their slogan reading, "If it ain't cheap, it ain't punk." The label would be formed by Samantha Dorset and Chris Calvin, with Calvin formerly playing in the folk punk band Ghost Mice. Before the formation of the label, the scene mostly consisted of individuals doing their own thing. This label allowed the scene to blossom, really coming into its own in the early 2000s, signing some of the artists that would become synonymous with the genre. The same time period would see a gypsy punk scene form in New York, with bands taking Eastern European instrumentation and fusing it with the stylings of folk punk, creating an interesting take on the genre and spreading the sound to more locations. Examples include Golem, Insomniac Folklore, and Gorgle Bordello. Folk punk continued to spread like some sort of mud-related disease, with another scene forming in the northeast. Originally gaining some traction in the area due to the band Mischief Brew and Fistolo Records, the northeast scene would begin to flourish with bands introducing elements of Appalachian music and culture into the scene, as well as a good sprinkling of anarchist ideology. Everyone was joining the scene: the Can Kickers, Pat the Bunny, who would later be known as Wingnut Dishwashers Union. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention in the intro, the majority of folk punk names are incredibly stupid. Somehow this style was being spread all around the United States, with another scene forming in the West Coast, being more so inspired by cross-punk. Individuals in this scene primarily used acoustic instruments to allow them to busk and play on the street. Imagine a 60-year-old woman walking down the street and seeing three people who look like this, violently strumming a broken acoustic guitar whilst ranting about property damage. AJJ would actually form within the scene, creating some of the most beloved and popular folk punk music. Also, he made the Rabbit album. Unfortunately, the 2010s would see the decline of the folk punk scene that had developed in the decade prior. Pat the Bunny would retire from folk punk altogether in 2016, citing dramatic changes in political viewpoints and ideology as his reasoning. 2016 would also see the tragic death of Mischief Brew founder Eric Peterson, leaving a void in the scene that hasn't been filled since. Disruptions in the scene continued when Planet X ended in the same year. The founder would cite financial difficulties as the reason for the closure of the label. Folk punk has remained relatively popular in the underground, and a few popular bands like the Front Bottoms have taken elements of the genre and added a little bit of spice. Folk punk has remained interesting to me due to the simplicity and rawness of the genre. Music can sometimes get too caught up in the complexity, with many bands just trying to outdo each other. Folk punk stays true to itself. It just relies on the urge to make music. No fancy equipment, no studio, just a weirdo with a guitar ranting about whatever comes to mind. And at the end of the day, nothing screams musician like a smelly dude who lives in his car, playing guitar as fast as humanly possible, whilst ranting about how many cigarettes he's had for breakfast.
Yep. Back at it.